Welcome back to my channel, where we uncover the forgotten corners of the past. Today, I'm taking you into a story about the horrific lineage of the Dellinger family that you might have never heard before. A mystery buried in the dust of time. A truth that will send shivers down your spine. But before we embark on this journey, take a moment to let me know where are you listening to this story from. That helps me understand how far these secrets have traveled. And if this story truly captivates you, if it makes you ponder, don't hesitate to give me a like and subscribe to the channel to keep me going. Together, we'll explore the darkest pages of history, and you won't want to miss a thing. In the annals of American folklore, there exist stories of houses that are not merely structures of wood and stone, but living entities of malice and memory. There are tales of families whose legacies are measured not in wealth or prestige, but in tragedy and sorrow. But few narratives intertwine these two threads of horror as tightly, as inexorably, as the story of the Dellinger family, a lineage whose every heir, it was said, was born already doomed. Our story begins not with the birth, but with the return. A return that would unravel a century of secrets and awaken a hunger that should have remained buried forever. The carriage wheels groaned, their protest a low, mournful sound against the rain-slicked mud of the path. Fooey. Was with us. They had carved a lonely track through the dense Pennsylvania fog of 1882, a landscape that seemed to swallow sound and light with equal rapacity. Inside, a man sat rigidly, his forehead pressed against the cold, damp glass, his breath ghosting a small circle on the pane. He was watching, waiting. And then he saw it. Emerging from the shifting white veil was the familiar silhouette of Dellinger Manor, not like a home welcoming a long-lost son, but like a spectre rising from its grave. Its jagged roofline a crown of thorns against the bruised twilight sky. His name was Elias Dellinger, and 10 years, a full decade of his young life, had passed since he had last laid eyes upon his ancestral home. 10 years, confined, not by choice, but by decree, to the cold stone walls and barred windows of the Blackwood Asylum for the mentally afflicted. It was there that his frantic screams about shadowy figures at the foot of his bed, about whispering voices that coiled in the corners of his mind, had been methodically silenced. The physicians, men of science and reason, had employed the tools of the trade, escalating doses of laudanum that dulled the world to a grey slurry, and brutal cold water treatments that left him shivering and empty. He was, by the standards of the day, a man cured of his delusions. But as the carriage drew to a halt, a chilling thought surfaced in his mind. What if they had not cured him, but merely deafened him to a truth he was never meant to hear? "We've arrived, sir," the driver announced. The man's voice was thick with an unmistakable relief that had little to do with the end of a long journey. It was the relief of a man who had completed a perilous task and was now desperate to flee. As Elias would soon be reminded, the townsfolk of nearby Millbrook held their own diagnoses for the Dellinger affliction, diagnoses that had nothing to do with medical science. No one willingly approached the Dellinger property after nightfall, not since the hanging of 1842, a story that had since curdled into a cautionary tale told to frightened children. Elias stepped down, his worn boots sinking slightly into the rain-soaked earth. The air was heavy, saturated with the scent of wet soil, decaying leaves, and something else. The faint, metallic tang of cold stone. He stood for a moment, a solitary figure against the backdrop of the menacing house. At 32, with a face etched by ordeals far older than his years, he was a statistical anomaly, a living miracle of the bleakest sort. He had lived longer than any Dellinger male had managed to in 6 generations. His father, his uncle, his cousins all had been claimed before their 30th year. The asylum doctors, in their sterile, enlightened offices, had reviewed the family history and called the pattern a series of tragic, yet ultimately explainable coincidences, freak accidents, sudden, aggressive illnesses, bouts of melancholic despair that ended in self-destruction. The townsfolk, in their firelit taverns and hushed parlors, used a simpler, more ancient word. They called it a curse. "Will you be needing help with your belongings, sir?" the driver asked. His question was a mere formality. He was already backing away, his eyes darting nervously toward the manor's darkened, vacant windows, as if expecting to see a face staring back from the blackness. "No," Elias replied, his voice raspy from disuse, the sound foreign even to his own ears. He lifted his single, scuffed leather suitcase. "I travel light these days." It was true. The asylum had stripped him of everything but the clothes on his back and a mind that he no longer fully trusted. The driver nodded hastily, scrambling back onto his seat as if the ground beneath him were hot coals. "God be with you, Mr. Dellinger," he muttered, the words escaping in a puff of white vapor. His tone, however, suggested a deep-seated conviction that no god had set foot on this property for a very, very long time. As the carriage retreated, swallowed once more by the oppressive fog, its sounds faded into an unnerving silence. A silence so profound it felt like a physical weight on his eardrums. Elias was alone. He turned to face the looming structure, the architect of his family's ruin. Dellinger Manor had been built by his great-great-grandfather, Isaiah Dellinger, in the year 1789. It was a product of fierce ambition, a declaration of permanence erected using timber from the surrounding forest and stone, quarried from the very land it stood upon. This land, according to local legends preserved more faithfully than any county record, held a dark history of its own. It was said to have been acquired from the Lenape tribe, not through fair treaty, but through bloodshed and deceit during a time of great upheaval. A document, allegedly a letter from a local missionary dated 1785, spoke of a man of great wealth and dark temperament who seized the sacred hunting grounds, leaving behind nothing but sorrow and whispers of a curse upon the soil itself. The house, therefore, was born from a wound in the earth, its foundations steeped in a forgotten injustice, its very stones imbued with a latent bitterness. Its grand Victorian architecture, with steep, imposing gables and ornate trim that once stood as the pride of the county, was now a monument to a slow, inexorable decay. The paint, once a pristine white, now peeled in long, leprous strips, revealing the dark weathered wood beneath like rotting flesh exposing bone. The windows, many of them cracked, were clouded with years of grime and neglect, looking less like portals to a home and more like the cataract-filled eyes of a blind, forgotten giant. The great front door, fashioned from heavy oak, groaned open on its hinges before Elias could even reach for the tarnished brass knocker. It moved with a deliberateness that was not the work of a breeze, opening just enough to issue a silent, unholy invitation. A sliver of dim, dusty light cut through the oppressive darkness within. "Master Elias?" A thin voice called from the void. The sound was as brittle as dry leaves skittering across a tombstone. "We have been expecting you." In the doorway stood Mrs. Winters, her gaunt frame a stark silhouette against the weak light of the entrance hall. At 73, the housekeeper had served 3 generations of Dellingers. She was a silent, stoic witness to each of their tragic ends, a human relic who had somehow endured while the bloodline she served withered and died around her. Her eyes, which Elias vaguely remembered from childhood as being a bright cornflower blue, had faded to the flat, lifeless color of dishwater. Yet they still held a sharpness, an unnerving perception that made Elias feel as if she was seeing not just the man before her, but the ghosts that trailed in his wake. "Miss Winters," he acknowledged with a slight, formal nod, trying to keep his composure. Her unchanging presence was both a comfort and a profound source of unease. "I was not aware anyone still maintained the property." "The Dellinger estate pays for a basic upkeep," she replied, her voice as devoid of warmth as the hall itself. She stepped aside, a slow, deliberate movement to let him enter. "Though I am afraid much has fallen into disrepair since your departure. Time is not kind to this house." He stepped across the threshold, and the air inside was a physical presence that immediately assaulted his senses. It was thick and cold, carrying the smell of dust, pervasive wood rot, and something else, an undertone that was sweeter, almost cloying, like the scent of overripe fruit or wilting funeral flowers left to decay in a sealed room. He had smelled it before, in the deepest recesses of his childhood memories. Elias removed his hat, revealing a shock of prematurely graying hair, the Dellinger's silver. They called it, and a thin white scar that ran from his right temple to his jawline. It was a souvenir from one of his more violent, agitated days at the asylum, a permanent reminder of his struggle against things no one else could see. "Your room has been prepared, Miss..." Winters continued, her footsteps making no discernible sound on the creaking floorboards as she led him toward the grand staircase. It was as if she floated over them. "The east wing remains closed. Master Elias, that was your father's final, most insistent instruction before his passing." Elias paused at the foot of the stairs, his hand hovering over the smooth, cold wood of the balustrade. His gaze was drawn irresistibly, as if by a magnetic force, to the grand portrait hanging above the great stone fireplace. It depicted the patriarch himself, Isaiah Dellinger, standing proudly beside his wife, a woman of gentle features, and an infant son wrapped in lace. The artist had masterfully captured Isaiah's stern, commanding countenance, the sharp, predatory cheekbones, the deep-set, intelligent eyes, the thin, resolute lips pressed into a line that could have been a smile of satisfaction or a grimace of terrible resolve. It was a portrait of a man who bent the world to his will. Yet, as Elias stared, an unsettling feeling crept over him. Something about it seemed different from what he remembered. A subtle shift in the shadows, an alteration in its very essence. "Has that portrait been restored?" he asked, his voice low, taking an instinctive step closer. He narrowed his eyes, trying to pinpoint the source of his unease. Miss Winters glanced at the painting, her own expression as unreadable as a weathered gravestone. "No, sir. Nothing in this house has been touched. The dust is the only thing that has been added since you left." I could have sworn his eyes were different. Elias trailed off, shaking his head slightly. The doubt, his old enemy, was creeping back in. The physicians at Blackwood had warned him of this, that his mind might play tricks on him. that familiar places might conjure phantom sensations. A product of a traumatized psyche. Dr. Morris had called it. Never mind, he said, more to himself than to her, turning away from the portrait's piercing gaze. The asylum has left my memory somewhat unreliable. As they ascended the creaking staircase, each step groaning a weary complaint under his weight, Elias felt that other, more familiar sensation returning with a vengeance. It was the oppressive, suffocating weight of unseen eyes following his every movement. He had felt it constantly as a child, a feeling that had convinced his father that he was unstable, too dangerously attuned to the house's silent whispers to remain. It was this feeling, this certainty of a hidden, watching presence, that had been the first symptom of the Dellinger madness that had cost him a decade of his life. Now, returning to the source, he found it had been waiting for him, unchanged and infinitely patient. It was not a memory. It was a reception. The silence in his mother's room was a fragile, crystalline thing, a stark contrast to the oppressive spiritual weight that seemed to press down on every floorboard and seep from every wall of the house. This space felt preserved, not just from physical decay, but from the encroaching spiritual rot. It was a sanctuary of memory, a pocket of stillness in a sea of disquiet, smelling faintly of lavender and dried roses rather than dust and corruption. Elias turned from the grim vista of the cemetery, his gaze sweeping over the room, a place of tender ghosts rather than menacing ones. On the bedside table, beside a kerosene lamp with a clean, uncracked chimney, lay a single object that did not belong to the decor. It was a leather-bound journal, its cover worn smooth from frequent, perhaps frantic, handling. Its presence was not accidental. It was an intentional, deliberate placement, a final message left to be found. He moved towards it, his heart beginning a slow, heavy drumbeat against his ribs, a rhythm of dread. He knew the precise, elegant script that would be contained within. It was his father's, a cold premonition, sharp as a shard of ice, washed over him as he picked it up. The leather felt strangely cool to the touch. Opening the cover, his eyes fell upon the first page. The ink was faded, but the words were stark, written in his father's familiar, controlled handwriting, the hand of a man who measured his life in ledgers and logic. But these were not the words of a logician. They were a verdict. For my son, Elias, may you succeed where I have failed. The bloodline must end with you. Elias closed the journal with a sharp, definitive snap, a profound chill running down his spine that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. This was not a keepsake. It was a burden, a last will and testament of a more terrible kind, passed down not through law, but through blood. Before he could fully process the chilling implications, a sharp knock echoed from the great hall downstairs, followed by the thin, reedy voice of Mrs. Winters announcing the arrival of Mr. Hargrove, the family lawyer. The world outside the manor's suffocating embrace was intruding, bringing with it the cold, hard mechanics of law and inheritance, forces that seemed utterly mundane, almost laughably inadequate, in the face of the sentence he had just read. Silas Hargrove was a small, precise man of 65, with wire-rimmed spectacles and a neatly trimmed white beard that did little to soften his severe, perpetually worried expression. The Hargrove family had served as legal counsel to the Dellingers for 4 generations, a professional relationship that seemed almost as hereditary and inescapable as the Dellinger curse itself, though their own fates had been considerably less tragic. He stood by the fireplace in the cavernous drawing room, warming his thin hands over flames that fought a losing battle against the room's damp, bone-deep chill. "Elias," Hargrove greeted him, his voice dry as parchment. He extended a cool, bony hand. "It is good to see you looking so improved." The word hung in the air, laden with a decade of unspoken judgment. "Improved compared to what, Mr. Hargrove?" Elias asked, his own voice flat as he accepted the perfunctory handshake. "The raving lunatic you helped my father commit to Blackwood." Hargrove had the decency to look uncomfortable, his gaze flicking away toward the grimy windows. "That was your father's decision, Elias, not mine. I merely facilitated the necessary legal aspects. He was quite convinced it was for your own protection." "Of course," Elias said, gesturing to a pair of faded velvet armchairs. The pretense of civility was a thin, brittle veneer over a chasm of resentment. "Shall we discuss my inheritance? I understand there are conditions." They sat, and Hargrove produced a thick leather portfolio from his briefcase. The clicks of its brass latches unnaturally loud in the tomb-like quiet of the room. "Your father was very specific, meticulous, in fact, regarding the terms of his will," he began, extracting several documents tied amid with faded black ribbon. "The Dellinger estate, including the manor, all surrounding lands, investments, and accounts, passes to you as the sole surviving heir." He paused, adjusting his spectacles with a nervous energy, as if preparing to deliver a blow. "However, as you noted, there are stipulations." He handed Elias a document, the paper thick and expensive. Elias's eyes scanned the legal jargon, his mind cutting through the dense language until they landed on the clauses that truly mattered. First, he was required to reside at Dellinger Manor for a minimum of 1 calendar year before gaining full, unrestricted control of the assets. It was a cage, gilded with the promise of a fortune he did not want. Second, he was forbidden from selling or otherwise disposing of the property during his lifetime. The cage was to be his tomb. And third, the most important, the most chilling stipulation of all, a clause that seemed to writhe on the page: he must not marry or produce children. Elias looked up from the page, his eyes locking with the lawyer's. The air in the room grew thick, heavy. "He wanted the Dellinger line to end with me." It wasn't a question. It was a confirmation of the grim message in the journal, now legally binding. "Yes," Hargrove confirmed, his expression grave. "Your father was most insistent on that point. Should you contravene this clause and father a child, the entire estate is to be immediately forfeited and placed in a trust for various charitable purposes. You, in that event, would receive only a modest stipend for the remainder of your life, an amount barely sufficient for a man of your particular needs." Did he explain why? Elias pressed, the edge in his voice sharpening to a razor's point. Did he give a reason for condemning his own son to this? Hargrove hesitated, taking off his spectacles to polish them with a silk handkerchief, a deliberate, practiced gesture of procrastination. "Your father, he spoke of the Dellinger bloodline being tainted in some way. He used the word curse. Elias, of course, I attributed such talk to the immense grief and strain of advancing age. He had, after all, lost his wife, his brother, and effectively his son within the span of a few short years. And you never questioned it. Elias's voice was low, incredulous. You, a man whose family has witnessed generations of Dellingers meet with violent, inexplicable, untimely ends. You never once wondered if there might be truth to the local superstitions. I am a man of law, Mr. Dellinger, not of folklore, Hargrove replied stiffly. His professionalism a shield against a truth his eyes betrayed he did not wish to acknowledge. Though I will admit, he added, his voice dropping almost to a whisper, that the statistical improbability of so many accidents and illnesses befalling one family is noteworthy. As if summoned by his admission, thunder rumbled overhead, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from the very heavens. The gaslights in the drawing room flickered violently for a moment, casting the room and Hargrove's pale face in a ghastly, strobing light. From somewhere deep within the house, from a place that should have been silent, came a sharp, splintering crack, followed by a heavy, resonant thud. What in God's name was that? Hargrove asked, half rising from his chair, his composure finally shattering. Old houses make noises, Elias replied, his voice a mask of calm, though his own heart had begun to race. He recognized the sound. It was the sound of something heavy, like old furniture, falling in the sealed-off wing of the house, the east wing. Hargrove settled back into his chair, though he was clearly now desperate to conclude their business and flee. There is one final matter, he said. His voice hurried as he produced a small, ornate brass key from his waistcoat pocket. It was different from the keys Elias had seen before. Your father entrusted this to me, with strict instructions that it be given only to you, upon your return. He said it opens a safe in the library, located behind the portrait of Isaiah Dellinger. Elias accepted the key. Its cold weight was a small, solid piece of a terrifyingly large puzzle. Did he say what is inside? Only that it contains information vital to understanding your family's situation. He also left me with a final word of caution for you. Hargrove closed his portfolio with a decisive snap, his duty nearly done. He stood, eager to leave. He said, "Tell my son that I was not a superstitious man by nature. If I came to believe there was a danger in our bloodline continuing, it is because I saw the proof with my own eyes." After Hargrove's departure, a profound silence descended upon the manor once more. A silence now charged with intention. Elias now understood the true nature of his inheritance. It was not a fortune, but a prison and a mission. He retreated to his father's study, a room he had only ever glimpsed as a child. A place of stern commands and forbidden knowledge, using the key Mrs. Dean Winters had provided. He unlocked the heavy oak door. The air inside was thick with the ghost of his father, the scent of cold pipe tobacco, old paper, and that same faint, sweet odor of rot that seemed to emanate from the house's very bones. He settled into his father's massive leather chair, the worn material creaking under his weight as if recognizing a foreign presence, and opened the journal. His father's handwriting, so neat and precise at the beginning, chronicled the mundane business of a wealthy landowner. But as Elias turned the pages, he found other entries, stranger ones, often written in a different, darker ink, sometimes scrawled in the margins as if in a fit of haste or terror. Some passages were in what appeared to be code, or a foreign language Elias did not recognize. A frantic attempt to conceal a truth too terrible to write plainly. One entry, dated 3 months before Elias's commitment to Blackwood, seized his attention, and the words on the page seemed to vibrate with a terrible energy. "Eh, spoke of the figures again today. He claims they stand at the foot of his bed each night, whispering his name. Dr. Morris suggests increased doses of laudanum, but I fear it only dulls his awareness without stopping what is happening. The pattern is repeating itself, just as it did with my cousin Thomas, with my own father, with all of them. The blood calls to blood." Elias's breath caught in his throat. That was him. The words unlocked a flood of feverish memories, flashes of terror, in the suffocating darkness of his childhood bedroom. The unshakable conviction of being watched. His father's face, contorted not with anger, but with a mixture of raw fear and profound resignation. The asylum doctors had given his terror a name: hereditary madness. They had pointed to the Dellinger family's troubled history as clear evidence of a tainted mind passed down through generations. But his father's journal screamed a different truth. It was not a sickness of the mind, but an affliction of the soul. He read on, his fingers tracing the increasingly erratic script of a man losing his grip on a world of reason. "I have consulted the book again, but the pages relevant to our specific situation remain indecipherable. Perhaps it is for the best. Some knowledge is too dangerous, even in the pursuit of breaking the cycle." The east wing grows colder, despite the summer heat. Something is gathering strength there, waiting. "I have sealed off the nursery completely. No one is to enter, under any circumstances." The nursery? Elias frowned, a cold knot tightening in his stomach. He had a faint, dreamlike memory of a white door at the end of a long, dark corridor. A door his father had forbidden him from ever approaching. His voice, for once, losing its composure and taking on a sharp, terrified edge. The asylum had buried so much of his past under a mountain of medication and psychoanalysis. Now, his father's words were exhuming it. He was not just a madman. He was a witness whose testimony had been deliberately and systematically erased. The weight of this realization was crushing, yet it was also fiercely, terrifyingly liberating. For the first time in a decade, he felt a flicker of certainty that he was not, and perhaps never had been, insane. The final key, the one Hargrove had given him, felt heavy and purposeful in his pocket. The library. His father's letter had said, "The library," and the portrait of the man who had started it all. He made his way there, through corridors that seemed to hold their breath as he passed. The library was a cavernous room, its walls lined with bookshelves that reached 2 stories to the coffered ceiling, a silent congregation of forgotten knowledge. Dust motes danced like frantic sprites in the shafts of grey light that penetrated the tall, grimy windows. And there, dominating the room with its sheer presence, hung the portrait of Elias Dellinger. Unlike the family painting in the entrance hall, this one showed Isaiah alone, seated in what appeared to be this very library. His expression was severe, almost challenging, his deep-set eyes seeming to follow Elias with an unnerving, proprietary intensity. This was not just a man. This was a patriarch, a progenitor, a king in his domain. And he looked upon Elias not as a descendant, but as a long overdue debt. With a grunt of effort, Elias lifted the heavy, ornate frame away from the wall, revealing a small, wall-mounted safe embedded in the plaster. dark and cold. The brass key from Hargrove fit perfectly, turning with a soft, satisfying click that echoed in the vast, silent room. It was the sound of a lock and a history yielding its secrets. Inside, there was no gold, no jewels, no bundle of currency. There was only a single item, a large, leather-bound book. Its cover was unmarked, save for a strange, intricate symbol embossed in what looked like faded gold, a circle containing a complex pattern of lines that seemed to form a stylized, leafless tree, or perhaps a spreading, insidious web. As Elias withdrew the ancient book, a folded piece of paper, yellowed and brittle with age, fell from between its pages. His father's handwriting was instantly recognizable, but it was no longer the controlled script of his earlier journal entries. This was the scroll of a man at the absolute end of his rope, a man writing against time itself. Elias, if you are reading this, then I have failed to end our family's curse, and the burden now falls to you. This book, this damnable book, came into Isaiah Dellinger's possession in 1787 during his travels in Eastern Europe. It contains knowledge that should have remained buried for eternity, knowledge he used to secure our family's fortune, and in doing so, unwittingly sealed our doom. Elias's hands trembled as he continued to read, the words a death knell echoing across the years. Each one a nail in a coffin built a century ago. Do not read it in the house. Do not speak of its contents to anyone. And above all, do not attempt to use what you learn from it. The price is too high. The East Wing holds the physical manifestation of our sin. It must remain sealed. Should the barriers I have erected fail, burn the house to the ground and salt the earth where it once stood. I am so sorry for what I did to you. Son, I thought I was protecting you, but I see now I was only delaying the inevitable. The blood calls to blood, and the debt must always, always be paid. Your father. A cold, heavy weight settled in Elias's stomach. A sickness of the soul. A bargain. A sin. A price. The curse was not a myth. It was a transaction. As this monumental, house-shattering truth crashed down upon him, the storm outside finally broke its restraint in a display of sympathetic fury. A furious wind slammed against the manor, and rain began to lash against the library windows like 1,000 desperate, clawing fingers seeking entry. And then he heard it, gutting through the roar of the wind and rain, seeming to come from the direction of the sealed, forbidden East Wing, came another sound. It was high and clear and utterly, damnably impossible. It was the sound of a child's laughter. The sound did not fade. It lingered in the air after the thunder had subsided, a delicate, silver thread of horror woven into the oppressive silence of the library. It was a sound that logic could not process and sanity could not withstand. The laughter of a child, high and clear, emanating from a section of the house that had been sealed for decades, a place of rot and forgetting. In that moment, the lurid tales of the townsfolk, the frantic warnings in his father's journal, and the cold, hard text of the ancient grimoire in his hands all coalesced into a single, undeniable, soul-shattering truth. The madness was not in his mind. It was in the very bones of this house. A new resolve, born of sheer terror and a strange, liberating vindication, hardened in Elias's soul. He would not cower. He would not wait for the whispers to find him again in the encroaching dark. He would face the source, clutching the heavy, leather-bound book to his chest as if it were a shield. He grabbed a nearby oil lamp, its warm glow a pathetic but necessary ward, and left the library. He moved with a purpose he had not felt in 10 years, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous halls, each one a declaration of intent. He was no longer a patient returning to a haunted home. He was an investigator descending into a tomb that was waking up. Against all reason, against every instinct for self-preservation screaming within him, he followed the memory of the sound. He walked down the main corridor, his lamplight carving a weak, trembling circle in the gloom, and turned toward the dark, narrow hallway that led to the forbidden east wing. The air grew immediately, noticeably colder here, a damp, cellar-like chill that clung to his clothes and seemed to sap the warmth from his very blood. At the far end of the corridor, a heavy oak door barred the way. It was a formidable barrier, secured not only with its original rust-eaten iron lock, but with newer additions, heavy-duty hasps, multiple deadbolts, and crude steel reinforcing plates bolted directly into the frame. These were the desperate, failing efforts of his father to contain a nightmare. As he approached, a new sound reached him, insidious and low, a gentle, rhythmic scraping, like fingernails dragging slowly, deliberately, against old, dry wood. The sound came from the other side of the door. Elias froze, his heart hammering against his ribs, his breath held tight in his chest. Then, a voice. It was high and clear, unmistakably a child's, yet it carried a strange, timeless, resonant quality that did not belong to any living throat. "Father," the voice called, the word laced with a pleading, lonely tone. "Is that you? Father, I'm so cold. Please let me in." The voice was eerily familiar, vibrating with a part of his memory he couldn't access, a ghost of a forgotten connection from a time before the asylum. "Who's there?" he called back, his own voice barely a whisper, hoarse with dread. Silence stretched for several seconds, broken only by the storm's fury outside. The scraping stopped. Then the voice came again, closer now, right at the bottom of the door. "You know who I am, Father. You made me. Now let me in. I'm so very cold." A flash of lightning illuminated the corridor through a high, grimy window, and in that instantaneous and stark white light, Elias saw something impossible, something that would forever sever his final, fraying tether to the rational world. Fingers, small, childlike fingers, were emerging from beneath the door, reaching for him across the dusty floorboards. They were unnaturally pale, almost translucent like bleached wax, with blackened, broken nails that scraped noiselessly against the wood. They were not the fingers of a living child. Elias stumbled backward, a strangled gasp tearing from his throat, nearly falling in his haste to retreat. But the fingers continued to reach, stretching impossibly far from under the door, their joints bending at unnatural angles as they grasped at the air, writhing like pale, blind worms in a desperate, silent hunger. "Father, please." The voice called again, now tinged with a desperate, hungry whine. "The others, they hurt me. They're always hurting me. Only you can make them stop." Another blinding flash of lightning, and the fingers were gone, retracted in an instant. The voice fell silent, but as Elias, heart pounding in a frantic, wild rhythm, turned to flee back to the relative safety of his room, he caught sight of something else on the floor. Wet footprints, small, like a child's, leading not away from the east wing door, but toward it, as if something had just entered the corridor with him and walked through the sealed door as if it were mere smoke. He scrambled back to his room, his mind a maelstrom of terror. He locked the door, pushing a heavy dresser against it for a measure of security that he knew was utterly useless. He was gasping for air, his body trembling, drenched in a cold sweat. He had proof, irrefutable, physical, soul-shattering proof. He was not alone in the house, as if his thoughts had summoned them. The atmosphere in his own room began to change. The air grew heavy, charged with a static-like energy. A low humming sound started, seeming to emanate from the walls, the floor, the very air itself. It was a lullaby, a hauntingly familiar melody he couldn't quite place. Then, in another flash of lightning that turned night to day for a single, terrifying heartbeat, he saw them, figures, standing in each corner of his room. They were small, child-sized silhouettes with hideously elongated limbs and features that shifted and blurred like smoke when he tried to view them directly. They were perfectly still, watching him with eyes that reflected the lightning like those of nocturnal predators. The thunder that followed seemed to shake the very foundations of the house. And when the sound faded, the figures were gone. But the humming remained, now accompanied by words sung in a child's sweet, clear voice. A voice that was everywhere and nowhere at once. Hush now, Father dear. The hungry ones are near. They'll take your eyes and take your breath and rock you gently unto death. The storm reached its absolute crescendo. A tremendous, violent crash shook the entire manor. The sound of a century-old oak tree surrendering to the gale and falling against the structure. The impact was deafening. A shriek of tortured wood and shattering glass. It was followed, a moment later, by a human cry, a sharp, startled scream from downstairs. Mrs. Winters. Concern for the elderly housekeeper. A sudden, sharp anchor of humanity in a sea of supernatural terror overrode Elias's fear. Grabbing the lamp, he shoved the grimoire into his jacket pocket and hurried from the room. "Miss Winters," he called, his voice echoing in the darkened hallway. "Are you all right?" No answer came. As he descended the grand staircase, the lamplight throwing wild, dancing shadows, he spotted a different light moving in the entrance hall below. It was the wavering, solitary flame of a candle, held in Mrs. Winters's gnarled, steady hand. The old woman stood directly before the great portrait of Elias Dellinger, her face upturned, her lips moving in what appeared to be a silent, one-sided conversation with the painted figure. "Mrs. Winters," Elias called again, louder this time, his boots hitting the marble floor of the hall. She turned slowly, not with a start, but with a fluid, unhurried motion that was deeply unsettling. Her expression was unnervingly blank, her faded eyes reflecting the candlelight like polished glass, empty of all recognition or emotion. "They're restless tonight," she said, her voice oddly flat, devoid of the fear a normal person would feel after the house was struck. "The storm always makes them restless." "Who's restless?" Elias asked, taking a cautious step closer. "The children?" she replied, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. They have been waiting for you for so long. They've waited for the last one to come home. A chill, colder than any winter wind, ran down Elias's spine. What children? Miss Winters, there are no children here. The old woman smiled then. It was a terrible, empty smile that did not reach her eyes. A smile that transformed her familiar, wrinkled face into something alien and monstrous. Oh, but there are, Master Elias, so many children, all with your eyes, all with your blood. She stepped closer, the candle flame casting grotesque, dancing shadows across her features. They were supposed to be vessels, you see, each generation, one child to house the hunger. That was the bargain Isaiah made. But Isaiah didn't understand what he was calling forth. It wasn't satisfied with just one. It wanted all of them. All of you. Mrs. Winters, you're not making sense, Elias said, his voice a strained attempt at steadiness. I've served this house for 50 years, she continued, her voice a low, rhythmic chant, as if reciting a catechism. I have watched them take your grandfather, your uncle, your cousins. I have heard their crying from the East Wing every night for half a century. And now you have come home to them, just as the Master said you would. My father. No, she whispered, leaning closer, her breath smelling of grave dust and decay. The first Master, Isaiah. He speaks from the walls, from the portraits. He has been waiting for you, specifically, Master Elias, the last of his line, the final, perfect vessel. As she spoke, the back door of the manor, loosened by the impact of the falling tree, was flung open by a violent gust of wind, slamming against the far wall. The candle in Mrs. Winters's hand was extinguished, plunging the entrance hall into near total darkness. Elias fumbled with his lamp, raising it just in time to see the old woman turn and walk with an unnatural, steady gait, not toward the back door, but through it, out into the raging storm. Mrs. Winters, stop! Elias yelled, but his voice was lost in the howling wind. He watched, horrified, as she moved with purpose across the sodden lawn, her white nightgown billowing around her like a shroud, heading directly for the family cemetery on the hillside. Lightning flashed again, a brilliant, searing strobe, and in that instant, Elias saw that she was not alone. Figures moved among the headstones, small, child-sized silhouettes that seemed to flow rather than walk, surrounding the old woman, welcoming her as she passed through the cemetery gates. The back door slammed shut with a deafening crash, the force of it throwing Elias backward. The oil lamp flew from his hand, shattering against the stone floor. Fire bloomed instantly, the spilled oil igniting with a hungry roar, feeding on the dry wooden cabinets and ancient tapestries nearby. The house, it seemed, was finally ready to consume itself. Elias scrambled to his feet, frantically looking for something to extinguish the rapidly spreading flames. But as he turned toward the kitchen sink, he froze. Standing between him and the water, silhouetted against the growing inferno, was a child. The boy appeared to be about 6 years old, dressed in the formal, stiff clothing of another century. His features were unmistakably Dellinger features: the high forehead, the deep-set eyes, the sharp chin, But his skin was wrong, too pale, almost translucent, with a network of blue veins visible beneath. And his eyes were solid black, like pools of ink, reflecting the fire with a cold, ancient, and intelligent light. "Hello, father," the child said, his voice the same one Elias had heard through the east wing door. "I've been waiting for you to come home." Elias backed away, the intense heat of the growing fire scorching his back. Who are you?" The child tilted his head, an unnaturally fluid, bird-like movement. "I am you, father, a piece of you, a piece of all of us." He smiled, and his mouth revealed teeth that were too sharp, too numerous, like a row of tiny daggers. "Isaiah made us, and now we are hungry." The boy took a step forward, and as he did, his small form seemed to ripple and distort, limbs elongating, fingers stretching into claws. Behind him, more figures appeared in the doorway from the main hall, children of various ages, all with the same Dellinger features, all with the same wrong, pale skin and solid black eyes. Elias turned and ran, fleeing through the burning kitchen into the dining room beyond. Behind him, he heard the soft, rapid patter of small bare feet and the high, excited laughter of children at play. It was the sound of a game, but he was not the playmate. He was the prize. He raced through the labyrinthine lower floors of the house, pursued by the chorus of childish giggles that echoed from every direction. A sound that was all wrong, too eager, too hungry. The fire was spreading with an unnatural velocity, smoke beginning to fill the corridors, choking the air with the smell of ancient wood and something else, something acrid and foul. He reached the grand staircase, his only path to the book and journal he had left in his room. "Burn the house to the ground and salt the earth." His father's words screamed in his mind. For a fleeting moment, he thought this fire was the answer, a cleansing inferno. But a deeper instinct told him it wouldn't be that simple. Whatever dwelled here, whatever Isaiah Dellinger had invited into their bloodline, would not be destroyed by mere fire. He took the stairs 2 at a time, smoke coiling around his ankles. He had to get the book. He had to understand how to undo it. But as he fled upward toward the fading hope of knowledge, a chilling realization dawned, cold and sharp in the midst of the heat. He was not escaping the danger. He was being herded, driven inexorably toward the one place that remained untouched by the flames, the one place the spirits wanted him to go. He was being driven toward the east wing. Trapped! The inferno raged behind him, a wall of impossible heat. Before him stood the silent, inexorable advance of the spectral children. There was no escape, only a single path forward. With a final, ragged breath, Elias turned and limped toward the small, ivy-choked door of the east wing, the iron key feeling unnaturally cold in his hand. It fit the ancient lock perfectly. Turning with a silent ease, the door swung inward, revealing not fire and smoke, but a profound and complete darkness. He stepped across the threshold, the door clicking shut behind him, sealing him off from the world. Unlike the symphony of decay raging outside, the interior of the east wing was unnaturally preserved. Oil lamps burned with a warm, gentle light, illuminating pristine wallpaper and polished floors. The air smelled of beeswax and lavender. At the end of a corridor lined with the sorrowful portraits of dead children, a single wide door stood waiting. It opened to a nursery plucked from the previous century. A large cradle dominated the room, but it was the far wall that seized his soul. It was covered, floor to ceiling, with names and dates, written in what appeared to be dried, blackened blood. All Dellingers, all children, and at the very bottom, the ink still glistening wetly, Elias Dellinger, born 1850. The date of death was a chilling, waiting blank. It has been waiting for you to complete the pattern. A woman stood by the cradle, her form sorrowful and translucent. It was Eleanor Dellinger, Isaiah's wife. "In this house," she said, her voice an echo from a distant time, "we are all something less than living and more than dead." Isaiah's bargain with the entity he summoned was for a single soul each generation. But its hunger was insatiable. It claimed them all. A tremendous crash shook the wing as the spirits broke through the outer door. "They are here," Eleonora said urgently. "They will make you the final sacrifice." "How do I stop it?" Elias demanded, clutching the grimoire. "The ritual can be undone," she explained, her form flickering. "But it requires a sacrifice not to feed the hunger, but to close the door. Not just your death, Elias, your complete erasure from history, the entire Dellinger line, unmade, to never have existed, to erase a century of suffering. The choice was not a choice at all. It was a duty. What must I do?" Eleonora produced a silver dagger and several yellowed pages torn from the grimoire. "The final ritual. Here, where it all began." As the monstrous children burst into the corridor, she moved to the nursery door. "I will hold them. Begin now. Do not stop." She slipped through the door, her voice rising in a commanding, ancient language. Elias did not hesitate. He cut his palm with the dagger, tracing the circle on the floor with his own blood, speaking the words of unmaking. Outside, chaos erupted as Eleonora's fading power fought the horde. The nursery door burst open, revealing twisted forms of rage and hunger, but they could not cross the blood circle.
"Finish, Elias."
Her fading voice cried. He positioned the dagger over his heart. "I, Elias Dellinger, last of my line," he declared, his voice strong and clear. "Give myself willingly. Let the door be sealed. Let our sins be undone." With those words, he plunged the blade into his chest. There was no pain, only a spreading warmth, a great and sudden peace, and the sensation of falling, of unraveling, of finally going home. The Dellinger curse was broken, the hunger was banished, and history itself began to rewrite, erasing a name, a house, and a century of pain from its pages as if they had never been. What, then, is the legacy of a family that never existed? It is not found in historical records. Official accounts are clear. A merchant named Isaiah Dellinger purchased land in Pennsylvania in 1787, began work on a manor, but died suddenly and childless in 1788. The property was abandoned, the name forgotten. There was no curse, no generations of tragedy, no Elias. The legacy, then, is an echo, a persistent feeling. It is the local folklore of a patch of land that feels wrong, a place that is always cold. It is the academic puzzle of an excavation site revealing a single inchuni, empty grave containing an ornate silver dagger that defies all explanation. It is the unsettling trace of a story that, according to all records, never happened. The Dellinger family was erased, their suffering unmade by one man's ultimate sacrifice. But the land remembers. The soil remembers the blood. The wind remembers the whispers. And a fundamental question lingers in the cold, unsettling air of that lonely hillside, a warning that transcends time. What is the true price of a forbidden legacy? And is it possible that some sins are so profound that even when they are undone, they leave behind a permanent scar, not on the pages of history, but on reality itself?